and welcome to Being Patient Brain Talks. I'm Deborah Kahn, founder of Being Patient. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that I am fascinated with as a runner, and that is exercise in the brain. Admittedly, I'm kind of confused about what we actually really know how exercise translates into better brain health. So we thought we would go to one of the best experts, David Raichlen. He is an evolutionary biologist at the University of Southern California, and he really looks at how we have developed as humans and what our ancestors can tell us about exercise in the brain. So welcome, David, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks very much for having me on.
Okay, let's start from way back when, hunters and gatherers days. I mean, we know that obviously our ancestors got a lot of exercise because they had to go find their food and forage for it. What do we know? Let's start from those days with the hunters and gatherers. What do we know about exercise in the brain from way back when?
Sure. So, I think to me, this is really the critical context for understanding how and why exercise and physical activity is beneficial across our physiological systems today, including brain health. So, beginning around 2 million years ago, the best we can reconstruct, we see a shift in patterns of physical activity from more ape-like activity levels earlier on in our evolutionary history to the adoption of a hunting and gathering lifestyle at 2 million years, which was linked to much higher levels of physical activity. And we can see that in changes in the human skeleton beginning about 2 million years ago. We see lots of adaptations throughout the body that seem to support higher levels of activity. And then in our work with living hunter-gatherers today, we can kind of work with people who live this lifestyle and kind of get a window into what physical activity levels are like in this lifestyle. And we just see profoundly high levels of activity, especially compared to humans living in more industrialized societies today.
What does a lot of activity look like in the
Sure.
brain?
Uh, for hunter-gatherers today, we see activity levels. So there's a couple different ways that we can kind of think about it. Probably people are really familiar with tracking your step counts, like how many steps per day do you take? And for modern hunter-gatherers, we see step counts of up to about 18 to 20,000 steps per day. And so that's quite a lot considering most people in industrialized societies get around 6 to 8,000 steps per day. We can also think about activity levels in terms of what's called moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity. This is the type of physical activity that's thought to be most health enhancing. Our government recommends that we get about 150 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous physical activity to maintain health. The hunter-gatherers that we work with meet those guidelines in one day. So they generally get over 150 minutes per day of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So really high levels.
But I have to admit, I'm really confused about that because today, I was talking to you before and I told you I'm a runner. And, people have said, oh, you need to kind of slow down. As you age, you shouldn't run really fast because you're going to injure yourself or, I don't know. But at the same time, do we like 20 minutes of exercise a day, let's say, compared to our ancestors isn't a lot, right? And
Right.
so how does that translate to brain benefits? Like, what do we know about back then versus now in terms of consistency versus the amount we're actually getting?
So that's a really good question. I think it's really important to think about and talk about what do we mean when we think about our using our evolutionary history as context. And I think one of the things that we want to guard against is saying, well, that was what was happening in our evolutionary history, so that is the prescription for health today. And we know that's not necessarily true. One key part of evolutionary biology is that evolution and sort of these processes don't actually care about your health as you age. They evolutionary processes care about how you reproduce, how many offspring you have. And so the kinds of activity levels that we see in hunter-gatherers are not necessarily the best for aging, but they are the best for allowing those individuals to get enough food to survive and reproduce. So I think that's really critical because you don't necessarily want to use 20,000 steps a day, for example, as the marker for what is healthy. But what it does tell us, the reason I think about it as context is that it tells us, these kinds of studies tell us that our bodies evolved within the context of very high levels of activity. And that helps us understand why activity is so important to us. Now, what is optimal for brain health is an entirely other kind of concept. And that's something that we need to measure mostly in humans living in the context we're living in today.
Right.
And so, I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but just sort of as my guideline is that, more is better than less in terms of what we see. So if wherever someone is right now, adding a little bit of physical activity to their day is likely to generate benefits. And then as you kind of get stronger and more fit, adding more will likely lead to more benefits.
Okay, and before we move forward, and I want to unpack that in a moment, but I want to talk a little bit about the hunters and gatherers because, what they did was they'd feed, right? They'd catch their kill and then they'd feed, they'd rest, and then they'd get hungry again and go out again for the kill, right? So that pattern is also what a lot of people refer to when they talk about fasting, right? And
Mm,
diet and which is, as we know, all related. I mean, when you talk about the brain, it's hard not to talk about other biological
of
systems
course.
because they're all related, right?
Yeah.
So, do we know if that's actually a better pattern? Where I'm going here is we all talk about intermittent fasting today or go on a 4 or 5 day fast, and that's good for your brain and the hunter and gatherers are all often pointed as an example of that in a primitive state. So do we know that that's actually good for us?
I mean, we don't, I think that in many ways, the idea of hunter-gatherers being incredibly food stressed and fat having kind of enforced fasts is not entirely accurate because what we see, living hunter-gatherers have a really strong sexual division of labor. And so it is true that meat is not readily available at all times because that's a much harder resource to gain access to. But half of the population on a daily basis is going out and foraging for plant foods. And that makes up a huge portion of their diet on a daily basis. And so, especially, when I've been out living with hunter-gatherer groups, there's consistent food coming into camp every day, and people are not having difficulty getting access to food. It's just not always meat. So I think that's sort of a critical aspect of their lives.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. Of course. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What I want to
But I
talk.
also just so I can, I think there's been a lot of discussion in the literature about sort of the paleo diet. And again, it's like trying to use the evolutionary prism as a prescription. And I think one of the things that we've learned by working with hunter-gatherers around the world and looking at ethnographies from the recent past is that humans are not adapted to a single style of diet or a single way of eating, that humans are adapted to variety, right? Like
Yeah.
the human story is really a story of being able to accommodate new environments, new food resources, new patterns of living. That's sort of how we've succeeded in spreading out across the globe, that we're flexible and we eat a variety of diets in these sort of subsistence level communities. So I think, the paleo diet is really being adaptable
Yeah.
in my mind.
Well, and if you think about it too, environment changes all the time, right? And evolves.
Exactly.
So we have to adapt to that environment. So it does
Absolutely.
make a lot of sense. I want to talk specifically about the brain because what I was talking to you before we went live is my misunderstanding. I've been told exercise all the time because you're adding gray matter to your hippocampus being the area of your brain responsible for memory. But yet, then I've talked to other researchers who say, well, yeah, that's true, but in animal studies, and we don't know exactly how that translates to humans. So, what exactly do we know with, let's take that 20 to 30 minutes of exercise per day? What do we know about how it benefits the human brain?
Sure. So I think we see widespread benefits associated with, especially meeting those physical activity guidelines. There's kind of two types of studies that we want to be talking about when we're thinking about these kinds of brain benefits. One is our sort of cohort studies where people are able to follow groups of people and track their physical activity and then take measurements of brain volume in different regions. Those are association studies. So we can't make causal links from those studies, but we can look at associations. And then there are randomized controlled trials where people are randomly assigned to groups that are either going to exercise or not. And then we can, over time, we can look at what happens in the group that was randomly assigned to exercise, and that tells us something more causal. There is evidence from randomized controlled trials that hippocampal volume in humans does increase, especially in older adults, if they're randomly assigned to an exercise group. What we were talking about before we went live was what is that volumetric increase? And that's where it gets a little tricky in humans because we don't know if that's new neurons or increased blood flow or what's going on there that's driving the volumetric increase. But we know that the volume is increasing, and there have been studies that have shown that those volumetric increases are actually linked to improvements in memory in those randomly assigned exercise groups. Those studies are really hard to do, and so there are not as many of them that are really high quality. There are a lot more of these association studies, which kind of, if you think about them working in concert with randomized controlled trials, end up bolstering the evidence. And those association studies do show links between physical activity and brain size and regional brain volumes, not only in the hippocampus, but in frontal regions as well, that are associated with both memory and then with executive function. So decision making, planning, multitasking, things like that. Again, we can't causally link those from association studies, but it's important to know that in large samples, we do see links between being physically active and having larger brain volumes and better cognition.
What about a direct link between comorbidities that we know lead to bad brain health? So diabetes, for example, Alzheimer's is often called diabetes type 3 because of the
Right.
relationship between glucose metabolism and your brain, right? Glucose is being the energy source supplied to your brain. If you're not metabolizing it efficiently, it's bad. You have deficiencies in your brain in terms of energy sources. I'm now speaking like a layperson and not a scientist, as you can say. So feel free to correct me. But with that in account, if we exercise, we know those comorbidities can decrease, right? So that in turn is good for our brain. So what do we
Yes.
know about that relationship between other diseases that can be helped by exercise?
We know that, I mean, we do know that people with diabetes who are physically active have a lower risk, or that's associated with a lower risk of developing dementia later in life. Same with heart disease. So, this sort of whole cardiometabolic spectrum of diseases that do seem to have impacts on brain health, those impacts, or at least the risk of having those impacts, can be reduced by engaging in physical activity. And it brings up, this brings up a nice point of, and I'm sure maybe we'll be talking later about mechanisms, but what are the mechanisms linking physical activity in the brain? Some of those mechanisms might actually be reducing or minimizing these comorbidities, especially diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So we see, brain effects in terms of white matter hyperintensities, which are a vascular problem that can happen in the brain. When you exercise, you get a reduction in those hyperintensities, and those reductions may be telling us that we're seeing vascular benefits from exercise that are having brain associated benefits.
Okay, so interesting you should mention that because I had, and I wrote about this in my newsletter, a scan done by a company. It's a full body preventative, care scan. And one of the things they found is one of those white hyperintensity areas, which can be attributed to normal aging, I was told, or just to keep an eye on it. I've had two of those scans within 4 years and it hasn't gotten bigger. It's about the same. But of course, me being so brain obsessive, emailed a neurologist friend saying, "What does this mean? What should I do?" And he said, "Well, just do you exercise?" I'm like, "Yes, I exercise a lot." He's like, "Just keep exercising."
Yeah.
And I guess there's a reason behind that, right? Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Like the vascular problems that maybe, I don't know whether to call it a problem or not, but things that appear on a scan, how much control do we have over those with exercise?
A really good question. I think this is a really sort of ripe area for research, I think, is looking at the links between these white matter lesions and exercise and then future health impacts. White matter hyperintensities are an imaging feature that's associated with these white matter lesions that are linked to a higher risk of stroke and a higher risk of Alzheimer's disease and other related dementias. And they do appear to be associated with vascular problems in the brain. They are a part of normal aging as well. And so I don't think, and at least I'm not a neurologist, so I don't want to give out health advice, but from what my colleagues have told me, just finding white matter lesions in the brain on MRI is not something to be terribly concerned about, but they are associated with these risks. And we do know that physical activity can play a role in minimizing white matter lesion loads. And so that is one area, we have a few lifestyle behaviors that we can control. And so in my mind, if we see links between a behavior and a disease outcome or some intermediate outcome that may be linked to a disease, and we have some control over whether we can engage in more or less of that behavior, that's on us, right? That we should really try to modify our behaviors. And I think this is a really good example that, you find something on imaging that may be concerning. It hopefully is even more motivation to keep engaging in these behaviors that can minimize those features.
100%.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit, like you mentioned briefly, the mechanisms, the direct mechanisms in the brain when you exercise. What's happening exactly, and what do we know in terms of mechanisms and what's happening inside?
Yeah, so I mean, I think of a few different mechanisms, and we've kind of touched on two of them already. One is exercise and physical activity is just great for all the other physiological systems that are linked to the brain, so cardiovascular system, metabolic systems. So reducing cardiovascular disease and diabetes and other comorbidities is one mechanism that actually allows physical activity to be associated with good brain health. Vascular improvement. So we know that physical activity is one of the most powerful things you can do for your vascular system, and that improved vasculature brings more blood flow and more nutrients to the brain, which can be incredibly beneficial. And then the third mechanism that we think about when we think about exercise in the brain is the increased neurotrophic levels. And one in particular that we think about is a neurotrophin called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. And BDNF, we know from animal studies, is strongly associated with the birth and survival of new neurons, especially in the hippocampus. And so this is sort of what we were talking about earlier, that in animal studies, there have been direct links between physical activity, upregulation of BDNF, and the growth and survival of new neurons in the hippocampus that is linked to cognitive improvements and reduced risk of cognitive decline. We can't directly measure those new neurons in the human hippocampus, but what we can do is measure changes in BDNF associated with exercise, and we can see these imaging, increases in hippocampal volume, and perhaps those two are related. So those are sort of the three mechanisms. So, improving comorbidity risk, improving vasculature and blood flow to the brain, and then neurotrophic upregulation that's associated with neuronal health.
So can we supplement anything to boost that BDNF?
I mean, I have some ideas, but nothing, there's not a lot that's been tested specifically. There are some genetic polymorphisms that may be, so some people may be lucky in having sort of an increased BDNF upregulation with exercise. Whether there is some kind of exogenous substance we can take in that can improve that. It remains to be seen. If you can develop that, I can guarantee you will be a very happy and wealthy person down the road, right? Because prevention, in my mind, is probably our best bet against Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So if we can find ways to boost these neurotrophins that may be beneficial to preventing disease, I think we really could make a big dent in disease incidence.
100%. What do we know about different types of exercise and brain health? I mean, there's weight, as we age, we're supposed to put on more muscle, maybe reduce cardio a little bit. There's cardio, just pure cardio, bike riding, dancing. I've heard so many anecdotes about different types of exercise. What do we actually know?
It's a great question. So there have really not been direct head-to-head studies that have pitted different exercise regimes. So I kind of start with that we don't have the kind of head-to-head studies you would need to answer that question. But I can give you a little bit of sort of context where we can kind of think about what might be best. So there's also been less work on resistance exercise, I'll say that. So most of the work in this area has been focused on cardiovascular exercise. Sometimes I think that's because it's easier to do that with animal models, so the translation's easier because getting mice and rats to weight lift is not easy. There are ways to model that, but it's complicated. From my evolutionary perspective, one of the pieces that we've worked on is trying to understand why exercise is linked to the brain. And we have developed a hypothesis that exercise or physical activity in the brain are likely linked because that's what you need to do when you're foraging. And so when you're foraging for food, you are physically active, but you're also cognitively active. So you're using spatial navigation and memory and making decisions and really engaging in a lot of complex cognitive activity while you're physically active. And so we've done some work showing, and others have shown that activity that combines physical activity and cognitive activity may actually be some of the best exercises you can do. So this brings us back to what's the best exercise. If we think about the kinds of standard things that we do, yes, dance might be really beneficial because it's such a combination of physical and mental activity. I tend to think that, exercising in a gym, like getting on an elliptical or something is great exercise, but maybe including some outdoor activity where you're having to navigate and you're having to really pay attention to your surroundings might give you a little bit extra. That has not been like directly studied, so I want to be careful. We don't have an answer, but that's the sort of context that I think about, that what sort of could be the most beneficial.
I was just thinking we're so screwed because of GPS, right? No one ever
Yeah,
thinks about where they're going anymore. But if you really think about that, that's part of brain, health, like
absolutely.
navigating, finding your way, figuring out where to go. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm admittedly was born with a deficiency in directions, but it's even worse now because I
Yeah.
rely on my Strava, my exercise tracker, or when I'm driving, of course, GPS.
And it
So
is one of the first things that, it's a first sort of cognitive change that can happen is a more difficulty with spatial navigation. There are groups around the world that are working on these questions of using spatial navigation as sort of a biomarker of early cognitive decline because it is such a sensitive cognitive ability. And I think about it as it's fundamental to all animals, right? I mean,
yeah.
spatial understanding and spatial navigation is key to living in this world. And so you're very right that by, focusing and using GPS and maps, we don't really know what we're doing to ourselves right now.
100%. I mean, it makes me think just turn it off and get lost once in a while and figure it out?
Well, I think, I mean, I'm a runner myself, and I think because of what I study, I think about this all the time that, getting out on a new route and getting a little lost is actually probably really beneficial, versus just doing the same thing day in and day out on the same routes, on the same walking routes, whatever. Getting a little lost can kind of stress yourself cognitively, and it's likely beneficial in some way.
100%. I think about my kids too. I don't think my kids have ever read a map, right? They've had no
Yeah,
reason to,
yeah.
which is really really terrible to think about. But I don't even know if they know how, matching the grid and,
No, I think they'd have no clue. I mean, that's something they'll see in a museum, right?
Totally. So, David, tell me a little bit about your own exercise regime. What do you do?
Well, as I said, I mean, I'm a runner, and so that's my main form of exercise, and it's sort of it's it is my therapy, and it is my if I don't start my day with a run, then I've got some I feel kind of sluggish and not well
Same,
all day,
same.
and yeah, I mean, I hear about it. My wife is she knows when I haven't run that day, so and but I I can talk about sort of what I do, but I also stress like the reason that I do this is because I love it. And if I didn't love it, I wouldn't do it. And so I think when we think about like what kind of exercise should we do, I can tell people, maybe this is the best but really the best is the one that you enjoy and will do on a consistent basis because I know plenty of people who hate running and they're never going to do it. That's not something they're going to do
100%.
day in and day out for the rest of their life. I happen to love it. It sounds like you do as well. And I can't imagine my life without it. But, it may there are people out there who it's pickleball and they can't imagine their life without that. And there are people out there that it's just taking a brisk walk after dinner with their, friend or partner. That's fantastic, right? That is exactly what I encourage is whatever you love and you can't imagine your life without, that's the one that you should focus on.
So let me just elaborate a little bit on this because I've also been very curious about this. I think that I'm pretty ADD, right? Attention deficit. Like I do 100 things at one time and, and I'm in spurts. When I go for a run, exactly what you're talking about, I can focus, right? I can like write speeches in my brain when I'm running and I come home and I can sit at my computer and I can work if I've run. If I haven't, I'm completely scatterbrained. So I was talking to a doctor about this, and she said, well, that's not surprising because the medication we put kids on today for attention deficit is synthetic endorphins, right? And
Mm.
she said, what you're doing is by your morning run, you're having this huge burst of endorphins, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the chemicals in our brain and what we know in terms of stimulating the neurons. What do we know about that? Or is it just presumed because we feel good when we run and we know?
No, no, I don't think so. I mean, I think there's really good evidence for sort of neurochemical changes that are associated with that feeling that you get after a workout. So I've done work early on in my time in this field on endocannabinoids, which are the body's endogenous form of the active ingredient in marijuana. And then there's obviously a lot of work on endorphins, which activate opioid receptors and brain reward regions. And both of those work together actually in concert during and after exercise bouts. And they seem to be responsible for those feelings of well-being. The reason that you feel good for hours after a workout is because of these chemical changes in the brain. And you know, I always think about it from an evolutionary perspective. So I think about why these things evolved. And so, we think about these compounds as being analgesics. So they actually are pain relievers, which you can imagine being very beneficial for being physically active to have a little bit of pain relief. And also motivators. So when you feel good, it motivates you to do this activity again. So sort of motivating you to do something that is in an evolutionary sense, what you needed to do to find food. And so I think we can kind of hijack these evolved mechanisms to find the behavior that makes you feel good. And that's the one that you're going to want to keep doing. One of the cool things I think about the endocannabinoid system, at least from animal studies, is we also know, and the mechanism's not really well understood, but that if you remove that endocannabinoid signaling from rodent models, so you can knock out cannabinoid receptors, that exercise does not lead to the same kind of neurogenic activity or the birth of new neurons as if you have those cannabinoid receptors active. And so there seems to be a link between some of these molecules that are making you feel good and the brain benefits, the neuronal benefits of exercise. Again, if you like doing something, it's probably not just going to be beneficial to your mood. It's probably going to be beneficial to other aspects of your health.
100%. Okay, so tell us what the next phase of your research is. What are you researching right now? What are you hoping to discover?
So one of the things that I'm really interested in, it may sound a little boring, but I don't think it is. I'm really interested in sedentary behavior right now. It's not necessarily the flip side of physical activity, but the time we spend sitting is really interesting to me because it is our most common waking behavior. It's what we do, most people do for most of the day. I don't want to say everyone, but most of us sit for long periods of time. And when you walk into a room, you can, start looking around and you'll notice that we structure our entire inner space in our homes and in our offices and in public spaces around where you can sit. It's a really common thing. And what we've started to notice is that the times people spend sitting is linked with brain health in really interesting ways, not necessarily a linear way. We published a paper last year showing that the time people spend sitting is linked with the risk of incident dementia in a nonlinear way. So up to about like 9 to 9.5 hours per day of sitting, there's no change in the risk of developing dementia down the road. But after that, so 10 plus hours a day, the risks start to go up exponentially. And you see really high risks at 12 to 14 hours a day of sitting, which is a lot of sitting, admittedly. And so I've been really interested in this because when we think about motivating people to be physically active, I mean, who out there doesn't know that being active is beneficial to their health? But that doesn't necessarily translate into lots more people engaging in physical activity. But if there's another modifiable behavior like sitting, that's something that we can maybe tweak a little easier. We can sit less. You can find ways to kind of get up, break up your long stretches of sitting that may translate to some brain benefits. So my research right now and going forward is kind of incorporating this sedentary behavior angle so that we can maybe think about ways to tweak that part of our behavior to improve brain health.
But so does that mean though, if I go for an hour run and then I sit at my computer for 10 hours, it will kind of negate like sitting for that long, or does it not work that way?
So we're not sure that it works that way. So for
So
some,
don't sit for past 8 hours or so.
well, so it's complicated. So I mean, we know from some work on cardiovascular health that yes, exercise can rescue long periods of sitting. From our brain health studies, we've done one very detailed look at that question and found that it did not matter how much exercise you got, sitting for long periods of time, especially watching television, was associated with increased dementia risk. Sitting and doing cognitively active things seem to be associated with benefits. So it gets really interesting and nuanced. The accelerometer-based study, where we were actually objectively tracking the amount of time people spent sitting, we did not find much evidence that physical activity was going to rescue that risk. But I think that's sort of a major area for us to understand how to mitigate the risk of sitting. We can't eliminate sitting, and we don't want to because just like, again, taking our evolutionary perspective, when we worked with hunter-gatherers, they sit for about 9 or 10 hours a day. So, we our evolutionary history likely involved a lot of rest. There's a reason why it feels so good. There's a reason we gravitate towards sitting. It feels great, right? It is sort of the most comfortable we can be. And we don't need to eliminate it. We just need to minimize some of our long bouts of sitting.
Yeah, and even just, I mean, I'm guilty for sitting at my computer for 8 hours or so, but what I try to do, I have a house with a lot of stairs, so I'll run up and down the stairs a couple
Right,
of times, and that kind
right.
of breaks it up, right? So just
Yeah, for
even
sure.
little steps to be conscious of, okay, I've been at my computer now for a couple hours, time to go up and down the stairs a couple times, probably.
Yeah. I tell people to just like to drink a lot more water so you have to get up and pee every hour. I mean, that's the easiest reminder, right? It'll
Totally.
kind of stop you from sitting for a couple hours at a time.
100%. Well, thank you so much, David Raichlen, for sharing your research. We're going to post a link to your page. There's a lot of really interesting information in terms of what you've discovered and what you're discovering. Keep us updated and on any new research. It's a fascinating topic, and I know one that is of great interest to our community.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me on it. It's really been fun to talk.
It's been great. So, and if you missed any of this interview, we posted on beingpatient.com. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter. That's where you'll find out exactly about talks like these. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.